Amara woke up to the faint sound of dripping water from the kitchen sink. The apartment was small and dim, the kind of place where the sunlight had to fight its way through old, dusty curtains. The air smelled faintly of yesterday's bread and soap from the laundry she had done late at night. She pulled herself out of bed quietly so she wouldn't wake her younger brother, Elijah, who was still sleeping on the worn-out couch. His blanket was thin, and one of his feet stuck out from the side. She tucked it back in gently before heading to the kitchen. Opening the refrigerator was like opening a nearly empty box. 2 eggs, half a carton of milk, and a jar of peanut butter sat on the shelf. Amara sighed softly. She had learned to stretch what little food they had, but it was always a puzzle, always a choice between eating now or making it last another day. Her mornings were a race against time. She worked at a small convenience store 2 bus rides away, and the shift started early. Before leaving, she scribbled a note for Elijah. "Make a sandwich if you get hungry. I'll be back by evening. Love you," and placed it on the little table near the couch. The streets outside were still quiet as she walked to the bus stop. The cold morning air made her pull her thin jacket tighter around herself. She watched cars pass, shiny, expensive ones mixed with old, dented ones like the people who drove them, and wondered what it must be like to not have to count every coin before spending it. Her job didn't pay much, but it was steady, and in their world, steady was a blessing. The store smelled faintly of cleaning spray and the coffee machine that brewed all day. She stocked shelves, rang up customers, and mopped the floor during slow hours. The work was tiring, but Amara kept a small smile for every customer, even the ones who barely looked at her. Every dollar she earned had a place to go before it even reached her hands. Rent, electricity, bus fare, and Elijah's school needs. There wasn't room for extras. And luxuries were a distant dream. But what weighed on her most wasn't the lack of money. It was Elijah's health. Elijah had been born with a condition that made him weaker than most kids his age. Doctors had said surgery could help, but the cost was far beyond what Amara could imagine saving. She had tried to push the worry aside, focusing on what she could control, making sure he ate, making sure he felt safe, making sure he didn't see how scared she sometimes was when her shift ended. She stopped by the bakery near the bus stop. The owner, Mrs. Patel, often sold her dialed bread for half the price. "You work too hard, my girl," Mrs. Patel would say with a kind smile. Amara would smile back, thanking her, and leave with a small bag in her hands. The bus ride home was long, the sun dipping lower with each passing stop. Amara stared out the window, watching the city change from the bright glass towers downtown to the cracked sidewalks and faded storefronts of her neighborhood. She always noticed the difference, but she had long stopped being bitter about it. Life was what it was, and she had learned to find beauty in small things. A kind word from a stranger, a moment of laughter with Elijah, the warmth of fresh bread in her hands when she finally reached home. Elijah was waiting for her. He ran up to her with a smile, showing her the drawing he had made. "It's us," he said proudly, holding up the paper. The figures were simple, but he had drawn her with a big smile and himself standing tall. She hugged him tightly, blinking away the sting in her eyes. Dinner was simple, toasted bread with peanut butter and a small glass of milk each. They ate, sitting side by side on the couch, talking about Elijah's day at school. He told her about a science experiment they had done and how his teacher had praised his work. Amara listened intently, laughing at his jokes, letting his excitement be the bright spot in her tired day. Later that night, after Elijah had fallen asleep, Amara sat by the small window, staring at the streetlights. She thought about all the things she wished she could give him: proper medical care, new clothes, a safe home without leaky pipes or broken locks, but wishing didn't change their reality. And tomorrow, she would get up and do it all over again. Still, deep inside her, there was a stubborn hope she refused to let go of. She didn't know how or when, But she believed that someday things would change. Someday she'd find a way to give Elijah the life he deserved. She had no idea that the first step toward that change would begin in the most unexpected place, with a simple conversation, a plate of leftovers, and a man she never imagined meeting. It was a Friday afternoon, and Amara had just finished her shift at the convenience store. Her feet ached from standing all day, and the strap of her worn shoulder bag dug into her skin. She could have gone straight home, but she decided to walk through the downtown area instead of taking her usual bus route. The air was crisp, and the streets were busy with people in suits, tourists with cameras, and the soft hum of traffic blending with the chatter of outdoor cafes. Amara always liked this part of town, not because she belonged here at least. Not in the way the well-dressed people did, but because it let her dream. The tall glass buildings reflected the sky, and the shop windows glittered with displays she could never afford but still enjoyed looking at. She walked slowly, taking it all in, until the smell of fresh pastries and roasted coffee drifted toward her, drawing her attention to a cafe she had never noticed before. It wasn't just any cafe. This one looked like something out of a lifestyle magazine. Floor-to-ceiling windows, dark wood accents, tables with white tablecloths, and a warm golden light spilling out onto the sidewalk inside. The customers sipped cappuccinos and nibbled on desserts that looked too beautiful to eat. She paused at the window. Not to go in. She knew it wasn't a place for someone with only a few coins in her pocket, but to watch for a moment. That's when she saw him. Near the far corner by the window sat a man in a custom-tailored suit, his posture straight. Despite the sleek black wheelchair he sat in, his hair was neatly combed back, and his sharp features were softened only by the small smile he gave the waiter who poured his drink. There was something about him, not just his expensive clothes, but the quiet command in his presence that made him stand out from everyone else in the room. Amara recognized him immediately. Richard Hale, the man she'd read about in news articles years ago. A self-made millionaire who had built a chain of high-end hotels before an accident left him paralyzed from the waist down. Even after the accident, he had stayed in the public eye, donating to charities and appearing at events, though he was known for being private about his personal life. She didn't know why she kept watching him. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the way he seemed both strong and somehow alone. Then her eyes dropped to the table in front of him. A half-eaten meal sat there, still warm, alongside what looked like an untouched dessert. Her stomach tightened. She had skipped lunch today to save money, and seeing untouched food like that made her think of Elijah at home. She knew it was ridiculous to even consider it, but an idea began to form in her mind. An idea so bold that it almost made her laugh at herself. What if she asked him not just for the leftovers, but for something more? Not in a begging way, but in a way that offered something back, something meaningful. Her heart began to pound at the thought. She could just walk away. That would be easier. But she thought of Elijah and the upcoming medical bills. She thought of the nights they'd gone to bed hungry. And she thought of the stubborn promise she'd made to herself, that she would take every chance, no matter how unlikely, if it meant helping her brother before she could talk herself out of it. She stepped inside the cafe. The warmth of the place wrapped around her instantly, along with the faint aroma of cinnamon and coffee beans. Heads turned, just briefly, as she walked toward Richard's table. Her steps were careful but steady, her eyes fixed on him so she wouldn't lose her nerve. When she reached his table, he looked up, clearly surprised to see a stranger standing there, up close. His presence felt even stronger, not intimidating, but commanding. "Yes?" he asked, his voice low and even. Amara took a breath and said the words that had been building in her mind since she saw him through the glass. "Would you trade your leftovers for a miracle?" For a moment there was silence, and then he chuckled, not cruelly, but with genuine amusement. as if he wasn't sure whether she was serious or playing some kind of strange game. Her cheeks warmed, but she held his gaze, determined not to back down. Richard tilted his head slightly, clearly intrigued. "A miracle," he said, his lips curling into a faint smile. "That's a new one. You're going to have to explain that." And just like that, the unlikely encounter had begun, a meeting that neither of them could have predicted, and one that would change both of their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Richard leaned back slightly in his wheelchair, still holding that faint, amused smile. His eyes scanned Amara with the kind of practiced sharpness that came from years of business negotiations. Yet there was a spark of curiosity there too. "You're going to have to explain," he repeated, his voice deep but calm. Amara swallowed, aware that every word she spoke now would decide whether he sent her away or let her stay. She could feel the weight of the cafe around her, the low hum of quiet conversations, the faint clinking of cutlery, the subtle sideways glances from nearby tables. "It might sound strange," she began, "but I have something I can give you in return, something you won't expect, something I'd like to call a miracle." Richard raised an eyebrow. "And all you want in exchange is my leftovers." Amara glanced at the untouched dessert on his table, then back at him. "Not just the food," she said softly. "If you're willing, maybe something more. A little of your time, maybe a small kindness, in return for something that might stay with you for the rest of your life." He chuckled again, shaking his head slightly. "That's quite the sales pitch, but you'll forgive me if I'm skeptical." His fingers drummed lightly against the armrest of his chair. "You don't exactly look like a magician." She smiled faintly. "No, I'm not a magician, and I can't pull a rabbit out of a hat. But I can promise you this. I've seen people smile when they thought they never could again. I've seen hope light up in places it didn't belong. And I can bring you something like that." Her voice had a quiet strength now. And for the first time, Richard seemed to be listening not just with curiosity, but with a trace of interest. "Why me?" he asked, his tone shifting slightly, less amused, more serious. Amara hesitated for a moment before answering. "Because you look like someone who's seen a lot, and maybe forgotten what a small miracle feels like." That caught him off guard. For a fraction of a second, his eyes softened, but then his businesslike demeanor returned. "And what exactly do you get out of this little exchange?" She took a steady breath. "I'm raising money for my younger brother's medical treatment. We don't have much. I work every day, but it's never enough. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a trade. You give me what you can spare, and I give you something you didn't know you needed." The honesty in her words made him pause. He wasn't used to people speaking to him like that directly, without flattery or tiptoeing around his status. Around them, the cafe seemed to fade a little. The distant clink of cups and the murmur of other customers became background noise. Richard studied her for a long moment, his gaze lingering not on her clothes or her worn bag, but on the steadiness in her eyes. "You're either incredibly brave," he said finally, "or incredibly foolish." "Maybe a little of both," she replied, a small smile playing at her lips. Richard glanced at the plate in front of him, then back at her. "All right," he said slowly. "I'll bite figuratively and literally. I'll give you the food, and—" He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a slim wallet. "A little cash, but you'd better deliver this miracle you're talking about. Because you've got me curious now." Amara nodded, her heart pounding. "You'll have it tomorrow. Tomorrow." He leaned back again, intrigued. "So it's not instant?" "Some miracles," she said, "are worth waiting a day for." Richard chuckled again, this time not in disbelief, but in genuine amusement. "All right, Amara," he said her name, as if testing it, committing it to memory. "I'll see you tomorrow, and I hope for your sake, and mine, that you're as good as your word." As she left the cafe with a small paper bag and the folded bills in her hand, Amara felt the nervous energy buzzing through her veins. Tomorrow she would have to deliver. Tomorrow she would have to show him that her words weren't just pretty talk. Tomorrow the miracle would have to be real. What she didn't know was that Richard hadn't felt this kind of anticipation in years, and though he wouldn't admit it to himself yet, part of him already wanted to believe her. The bus ride home felt different that evening. Amara sat near the back, her paper bag of leftovers resting on her lap. The folded bills from Richard tucked safely inside her pocket. She kept replaying their conversation in her head, the way he had first chuckled at her words. The shift in his eyes when she mentioned miracles. And the way he had finally agreed to see her again tomorrow. It wasn't just that she had convinced him. It was that she had felt, for a brief moment, like her words had reached a place in him that people didn't often touch. When she stepped off the bus and walked the familiar, cracked sidewalk toward her apartment building, she was greeted by the sound of Elijah's laughter from inside. That sound was always the best part of her day. She pushed the door open to find him sitting cross-legged on the couch, drawing in his sketchbook. The smile on his face widened when he saw her. "You're home." "I am," she said, smiling back. "And I brought dinner." She opened the paper bag. Revealing the still warm meal and dessert, Elijah's eyes went wide. "Whoa, fancy food," he said in awe, as if she'd just brought him treasure. They ate together, Elijah savoring every bite. And as they did, Amara told him part of the story about meeting a man in the cafe and promising him something special for tomorrow. She didn't tell him all the details yet, but Elijah was curious. "What are you going to do?" he asked between bites. Amara leaned back, thinking. "Something that will make him remember us," she said. "Something that will make him feel the way we felt when we got this dinner, grateful and surprised at the same time." After Elijah went to bed, she sat by the small window with her notebook, jotting down ideas. She thought about what she could realistically do in just one night. She had no money for expensive gifts, no powerful connections to arrange something grand. But she had something that money couldn't buy, the community she had quietly built. Over the years, on weekends when she wasn't working, Mara often spent time with the neighborhood kids, teaching them songs, helping them with homework, or organizing little street performances to raise money for school supplies. The kids loved her, and she loved them back, like they were all part of a bigger, scrappy family. That's when it hit her. The miracle she could give Richard wasn't something he could put on a shelf or lock in a safe. It would be something alive. Something that would reach into the quiet corners of his life and fill them with light for at least a moment. She began making phone calls, her voice low, so she wouldn't wake Elijah. "Can you and your sister come tomorrow?" She asked one friend. "I'll bring the keyboard." Another promised. "Tell everyone to wear something nice," she added. "It's for someone important, and I want it to be special." By midnight, she had a plan, and a dozen kids from the block were ready to help her pull it off. She didn't tell them exactly who it was for, just that it was for someone who needed to be reminded of what kindness could feel like. The next morning, she woke early, making sure Elijah was ready. He wore his cleanest shirt, the one with the little blue buttons, and carried his small tambourine. "Do you think he'll like it?" Elijah asked as they headed out. "I think," Amara said, smiling down at him. He won't forget it for the rest of his life. As the bus carried them toward the cafe, Amara felt a mix of nerves and excitement. She had no idea how Richard would react. Maybe he would think it was silly. Maybe he wouldn't understand what she was trying to do. But she also knew this. The kind of miracle she was about to deliver didn't come wrapped in ribbons or marked with a price tag. It came in the form of music, laughter, and the reminder that even in the heaviest moments of life, there was still room for joy. And somewhere, deep down, she had a feeling that Richard Hale, paralyzed millionaire, man of the world, might just need that reminder more than he knew. The cafe looked exactly as it had the day before. Polished windows, the warm glow of hanging lights, the faint aroma of roasted coffee drifting into the street. Richard Hale was already there. Sitting at the same table by the window, a cup of black coffee in front of him. He wore a light gray suit today, and his expression was its usual calm, unreadable mask. The kind that gave nothing away in business deals or casual conversations, but there was something different in his eyes. Yesterday, Amara had walked in as a stranger. A curiosity at best. Today, he was actually waiting for her, though he wouldn't have admitted it to anyone, not even to himself. When the glass door opened and Amara stepped inside, Richard's gaze flicked up immediately. She looked almost the same as yesterday. Same modest clothes, same worn bag over her shoulder. But there was something about the way she carried herself now. A quiet determination that seemed to fill the space around her. Beside her walked a small boy, Elijah, holding a tambourine close to his chest as if it were made of gold. Richard raised an eyebrow. "You're early," he said. As she approached, "Some miracles don't wait for the clock," Amara replied with a small smile. He studied her for a moment before gesturing to the seat across from him. "So, this is the big reveal." "Not yet," she said, shaking her head. "We'll need to step outside for that." Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, curiosity sparking again. "Outside?" "Yes," she said simply. "It's not something that fits in here. It's bigger than a table and 2 chairs." The businessman in Richard wanted to ask for details, to negotiate, to pin down exactly what she was talking about before agreeing. But something about her confidence made him decide against his usual instincts. To go along without knowing, he finished the last sip of his coffee, then nodded toward the door. "Lead the way." As they exited the cafe, Richard maneuvered his wheelchair easily over the smooth pavement. The street was lively, a mix of locals walking their dogs, tourists taking photos, and the occasional cyclist weaving through traffic. But a small crowd had already gathered near the corner, standing in a semicircle that seemed to be waiting for something. Amara led him closer, Elijah walking proudly beside her. And then Richard saw them, a group of about a dozen children, dressed in their cleanest clothes, each holding a different instrument, a second-hand keyboard, a few guitars, hand drums, even a makeshift shaker made from a jar of beans. They stood together like a tiny orchestra, eyes bright, cheeks flushed with excitement. "What is this?" Richard asked quietly, his voice caught somewhere between suspicion and wonder. "This," Amara said, turning to face him, "is your miracle." The children straightened, and at Amara's nod, they began to play. It wasn't perfect. A few notes wobbled here and there, but the sound was alive, full of warmth and hope. Their music filled the street, drawing more passers-by to stop and listen, phones coming out to record the scene. Richard sat completely still, his hands resting lightly on the armrests of his chair. His eyes scanned the children's faces, then Amara's. She was clapping softly to the rhythm, her eyes never leaving the kids as they sang. The lyrics caught his attention. They weren't just any song. It was about kindness, about giving, even when you thought you had nothing. About how the smallest gesture could change someone's day. And then, in the final verse, there was a line about trading what you don't need for the miracles you never saw coming. He realized then that she had written this song. It wasn't just music. It was a message meant for him. When the last note faded, the street erupted. In gentle applause, the children beamed, Elijah shaking his tambourine with a proud grin. Richard's voice was quiet when he finally spoke. "You planned this?" "Yes," Amara said simply, "with their help." She gestured to the children. "They're from my neighborhood. We do little performances sometimes to raise money for school supplies. But today, this was just for you." Richard looked at her for a long moment, the sound of the applause still echoing faintly. For the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him, a mixture of gratitude, humility, and the faint ache of being seen. really seen, by someone who had nothing to gain but still chose to give. "Well," he said, his voice almost rough, "I suppose I owe you more than just a meal now?" For a long moment after the applause faded, Richard didn't speak. The street noise slowly crept back, the distant honk of a car horn, the shuffle of footsteps, the soft murmur of onlookers. But for him, it felt as if time had paused. He sat there in his wheelchair, still watching the children as they laughed among themselves, packing up their instruments, Elijah still shaking his tambourine with quiet pride. Finally, Richard looked at Amara, his gaze steady but softer than before. "You said you'd bring me a miracle," he said, his voice low, "and I think you might have actually done it." Amara smiled faintly, not out of victory, but from relief. "I told you. Miracles aren't always about grand gestures. Sometimes they're about moments that remind us we're still human." Richard let the words sink in. He thought about how he had spent years building walls around himself, not physical walls, but the invisible kind after the accident. He had learned to keep his emotions contained, his interactions polite but distant. And yet, here was this young woman who had walked into his life uninvited, made a strange offer, and somehow chipped through those walls in less than 24 hours. He took a deep breath. "Tell me about your brother," he said suddenly. Amara hesitated, then nodded. "His name is Elijah. He's 10, he's smart, loves drawing. And he has a condition that makes him weaker than most kids his age. There's a surgery that could help him, but—" She trailed off, shrugging slightly. "It costs more than I could save in years. I wasn't looking for a miracle for me. I was looking for one for him." Richard looked toward Elijah, who was now sitting on the curb, showing one of the younger kids how to hold the tambourine properly. There was something in the boy's face, joy, innocence, and a resilience that felt familiar without another word. Richard reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a sleek black checkbook. Amara's eyes widened. "What are you?" He held up a hand. "Don't interrupt." "Me," he said, his tone returning to that calm authority. But this time, without the cold edge, he began writing, his pen gliding smoothly across the page. When he finished, he tore out the check and handed it to her. Amara stared down at it, her breath catching. The number written there was enough to cover Elijah's surgery, aftercare, and more. This is too much," she whispered, her hands trembling. Richard shook his head. "It's exactly enough." He looked her straight in the eye. "Yesterday, you could have asked me for money like everyone else does, but you didn't. You offered me something first, something no one has in a long time: sincerity. That's worth more than any business deal I've ever made." Amara blinked hard, trying to hold back the tears that burned at the edges of her vision. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. "Don't thank me," Richard replied, glancing at the children now chatting happily nearby. "Just keep doing what you do. Keep giving people those little miracles. You might be surprised at how many lives you change." By now, a few people in the crowd had realized who Richard was and were quietly whispering his name, but he ignored them. He reached into his wallet again and pulled out a crisp business card, handing it to her. "If you ever need anything, advice, connections, support for your community projects, call me. Don't hesitate." Amara took it carefully. As if it were more fragile than glass, she knew in that moment that this meeting wasn't just about Elijah's surgery anymore. It was the start of something bigger. Richard glanced toward the cafe, then back at her, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Now, I believe I still owe your brother dessert. Let's fix that before we call it a day, for the first time in a long while." Amara felt a deep sense of security settle over her, not because of the money in her hands, but because she had met someone who saw her worth without her having to prove it through wealth or status. And for Richard, it was the first time in years he felt like his wealth had bought him something truly priceless, a connection that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with being human. Richard's decision to give Amara the check could have been a quiet, private moment. He could have slipped it into her hand and sent her on her way. But something in him, maybe the echo of the song the children had just played, maybe the sight of Elijah's hopeful face, made him want the moment to be more than just a personal gesture. He looked around at the small crowd that had gathered. The curious onlookers who had paused to hear the music, some were smiling, others still whispering. But all of them had seen a young woman stand proudly in front of a wealthy man and offer him something far more meaningful than pity or flattery. Richard turned his wheelchair slightly so that his voice would carry. "This young lady," he began, nodding toward Amara, "came to me yesterday with one of the strangest requests I've ever heard, to trade my leftovers for a miracle." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, but in the end, the miracle wasn't for me. He continued, his tone steady but warm. It was for her brother, for these children, and maybe for everyone standing here. Amara felt her face flush. Unused to so many eyes on her, she wanted to step back, to fade into the crowd. But Richard's words held her in place. "She reminded me of something I'd forgotten," Richard said, glancing at the children, that the smallest acts, a meal, a song, a shared moment, can be more powerful than money. He then held up the check he had written for her, not in a showy way, but so that those closest could see. "I'm giving her this to make sure her brother gets the treatment he needs," he said. "And I'm also committing to fund her community program for these kids for the next year." A murmur of surprise and approval spread through the crowd. Phones came up, capturing the moment, not for gossip, but because it was rare to see generosity play out so openly and sincerely. One man in a business suit stepped forward. "If she's running something for the kids, I'd like to donate to," he said, pulling out his wallet. A woman holding a toddler nodded. "Me too. I can't give much, but I can help with supplies." Amara's heart swelled as one by one, people began offering support, not just money, but time, materials, instruments, even volunteer teaching. What had started as one bold request had now turned into a chain reaction of kindness. Elijah beamed from the sidelines, his tambourine clutched tightly in his small hands. For him, this wasn't just about the surgery anymore. It was about seeing his sister's courage inspire an entire street of strangers. Richard smiled faintly, watching it all unfold. "This," he said quietly to Amara, "is why I wanted it to be public. Kindness spreads faster when people can see it." She looked at him, eyes glistening. "I don't know how to thank you. You?" "Already have," he replied simply, glancing at the children once more. "Yesterday, you gave me back something I didn't know I'd lost." The crowd began to disperse slowly, but the energy lingered, the kind of energy that leaves people walking away a little lighter, a little more willing to help the next person they meet. For Amara, the moment felt surreal. In just 2 days, she had gone from being turned away from countless opportunities to standing beside a man whose influence could open doors she'd never imagined. And for Richard, it was proof that even in a life marked by wealth and success, there were still new kinds of riches to be found. The kind that came from giving, not receiving. Asterisk 2 months later, the air inside the hospital was cool and sterile. The faint scent of antiseptic lingering in the halls. Amara sat in the waiting area, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Elijah's surgery was underway, and every tick of the clock felt like an hour. She glanced beside her, where Richard sat in his wheelchair, calm but attentive, reading the updates on his tablet between sipping his coffee. He hadn't just written a check and disappeared. From the moment he decided to help, he had been there meeting the doctors, making sure the best surgeon was assigned, covering every expense so Amara wouldn't have to think about anything except her brother when the surgeon finally emerged. With a tired smile and the words, "The procedure went perfectly," Amara felt her knees weaken, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. Richard reached over and rested a hand gently on her arm. "I told you," he said quietly. "Some miracles are worth waiting for." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Elijah recovered faster than anyone expected, his strength returning with each passing day. Soon, he was back to drawing, playing music, and running, actually running in a way Amara had never seen before. Meanwhile, the community music program that Amara had been running informally now had official funding. Thanks to Richard's pledge, they moved into a small rented space with bright yellow walls, shelves of donated instruments, and a sign over the door that reads Small Miracles Music Club every week. Children from the neighborhood came to learn songs, practice instruments, and in Amara's words, trade what they can do for what they can dream. Richard visited often, sometimes just to watch the kids play, other times to share his own stories about resilience, though he never spoke about it directly. Everyone could see the way his eyes softened when Elijah came up to show him a new drawing or play a tune on the tambourine. One afternoon, months later, Amara stood outside the music club as the sun dipped low, casting golden light across the street. She looked through the window and saw Elijah laughing with the other kids, Richard smiling faintly from his usual spot. It struck her how much had changed, not just for her and Elijah, but for Richard too. She thought back to the first moment she'd seen him in the cafe. She could still hear his chuckle when she'd asked, "Would you trade your leftovers for a miracle?" Neither of them could have known then that the answer would be yes, not just for one miracle, but for many. The story of that day had spread far beyond their little corner of the city. Videos of the street performance and Richard's speech had been shared online millions of times. Letters came from people across the country, telling Amara that her courage had inspired them to ask for help, to offer kindness, or to simply believe that change was possible. As the last child left the music club that evening, Amara locked the door and turned to find Richard waiting by his car. "You know," he said with a small smile, "when I laughed that day in the cafe, I thought you were just a bold kid with a strange idea. I didn't realize you'd end up changing my life." Amara smiled back. "Guess we both got more than we bargained for." They stood there for a moment, the hum of the city around them, the golden lights stretching their shadows across the pavement. Two people from completely different worlds, forever connected by a single act of courage, a shared moment of humanity, and the belief that miracles, big or small, are worth making. A year had passed since that afternoon outside the cafe. The seasons had turned, and with them, so had the lives of everyone touched by that one unusual encounter. The Small Miracles Music Club was no longer just a rented room in the neighborhood. Thanks to Richard's continued support and the generosity of others inspired by the viral story, it had expanded into a bright, two-story community center with practice rooms, a small performance hall, and even a recording booth for the older kids who dreamed of making music professionally. Elijah had become the heart of the place, not just as Amara's little brother, but as one of its most passionate members. He was taller now, healthier, his energy no longer limited by the condition that once held him back when visitors came. Journalists, donors, curious locals, he was always the first to greet them, tambourine in hand, telling them, "This place is proof that miracles are real." Amara had grown too. Running the center had transformed her from a struggling young woman into a confident leader. She learned to manage budgets, organize events, and speak to large audiences about the power of small acts of kindness. She had even been invited to give talks at schools and community conferences, where she would start every speech with the same line, "Sometimes the most important doors open because you knock on them without knowing what's inside." Richard, though still private about most of his life, had become something of a silent patron for similar initiatives. Inspired by Amara's persistence and courage, he funded other grassroots programs around the city, focusing on projects that empowered people rather than simply giving them temporary relief. He rarely sought credit. But word of his work always seemed to find its way back to the community he had helped build. Every year on the anniversary of their first meeting, Richard and Amara would sit together at the cafe, the same table by the window, and share a quiet meal. They never made a big event out of it, but it had become their tradition. They would talk about the children at the club, Elijah's latest accomplishments, and the new dreams that were taking root in the neighborhood. The world had moved on from the viral video, as it always does. New stories replaced old ones, and the internet's attention shifted. But for those who had been there, for the people whose lives had changed because of it, the impact had not faded. One evening, as Amara locked up the music center, she stepped outside to find a group of teenagers waiting. They told her they'd heard about her from their music teacher and wanted to volunteer. They didn't want money. They just wanted to be part of something that made people feel seen and valued. As she let them in and showed them around, Amara realized that the miracle she'd once promised Richard had never really ended. It had simply grown, spreading from her to him, from him to others, and from others to people she might never meet. Later that night, walking home with Elijah, she glanced at the cafe across the street, the golden light still spilling onto the sidewalk. She thought of that first day of the chuckle in Richard's voice when she'd made her strange request, and how neither of them could have known that it would be the start of something far bigger than either of their lives alone. 10 years had passed since Amara first stepped into that cafe with nothing but a bold idea and a question about trading leftovers for a miracle. In those years, the Small Miracles Music Club had grown from a humble neighborhood program into a city landmark, known not just for music, but for the way it changed lives. The building was no longer just 2 stories. It had expanded into a modern, glass-fronted center with classrooms, studios, and a rooftop garden where children could practice under the open sky. Murals covered the sidewalls, painted by the kids over the years, each one telling a story of hope, resilience, and community. Elijah, now in his 20s, had become a professional musician and one of the center's lead instructors. His journey from a boy who once struggled to walk to a man who could stand tall before a crowd with a guitar in his hands was living proof of what the place stood for. Whenever he performed, he always told the story of his sister and the man in the cafe who changed their lives. Amara herself had evolved into more than just the founder. She was a mentor, a community leader, and a voice for grassroots initiatives across the country, traveling to speak at conferences and advise other neighborhoods on building programs from the ground up. But no matter how far she went, she always returned home because this was where it all began, and where her heart remained. Richard had grown older, the silver in his hair now pure white, but his sharp mind and warm presence had not faded, though he no longer attended every event. He made sure to visit the center often, sometimes rolling quietly through the halls just to listen to the music spilling out of each room. The children knew him not as a millionaire or a businessman, but as Mr. Richard, the man who believed in them before they even believed in themselves. On the 10th anniversary of their first meeting, the community held a celebration at the center. There was music, dancing, and a photo wall showing the club's journey from the first tiny rented room to the thriving hub it had become. One picture near the center caught everyone's attention. A younger Amara standing in the street with the children and Elijah. Richard watching from his wheelchair, his face caught in a rare, unguarded smile that evening. As the crowd thinned, Amara and Richard found themselves sitting together in the quiet rooftop garden. The city lights stretched out around them, the soft hum of distant traffic mixing with the faint sound of a guitar from one of the classrooms below. "You know," Richard said, his voice softer now, "when you first walked up to my table, I thought you were just some bold kid looking for a handout. I didn't know you'd end up building all this." He gestured to the building below. where laughter and music still floated up through the open windows. Amara smiled. "And I didn't know you'd end up being like family." They sat there for a moment, the weight of 10 years settling between them. Not heavy, but solid, like the foundation of the place they had built together. The miracle Amara had promised him so long ago had not only been delivered, it had multiplied. It had lived on in every child who found confidence in their voice, in every family who found hope inside those walls, and in every act of kindness that had rippled out from that one simple request. When they finally stood to leave, Richard paused, looking out at the skyline. "Funny thing about miracles," he said, "most people think they're rare, but the truth is, they're everywhere. You just have to give them a reason to show up." Amara glanced at him, her smile warm. "Guess we gave them a reason," and together, they made their way back down, into the place where the music never stopped, and where a single conversation in a cafe had grown into a legacy that would outlive them both.